On August 10th of 2018, The Hollywood Reporter broke the scoop that both Chris Hemsworth and, worse yet, Chris Pine, Captain Kirk himself, had dropped out of Star Trek IV. Despite some news articles and editorials claiming that Star Trek doesn't need Kirk, there has been no outwardly progress on Star Trek IV since then. In this video, we will recap the events that caused Hemsworth and Pine to drop out, the news updates since, and finally revealed what has transpired behind the scenes and the current status of the movie. As we have previously reported in greater detail, despite a strong start with the first Kelvin timeline Star Trek movie in 2009, each subsequent movie in the series cost more and earned less than the previous one. This trend culminated with Star Trek Beyond, a movie which bombed outright, and which caused its investors a loss in the vicinity of $100 million. Although they didn't necessarily know how badly Star Trek Beyond would tank in the end, the powers that be at Paramount and production company Bad Robot had access to early tracking numbers and knew that even in the best case scenario, Beyond would underperform. In order to preemptively counter their investors and funding partners getting cold feet following the imminent underperformance of Star Trek Beyond, they put together an offering tailored to secure further funding. In addition to the regular cast, the next movie would bring back Kirk's dad, played by pre-Thor fame Chris Hemsworth in the 2009 movie. Since then, however, he had become Marvel's Thor. Getting him back into the fold now would be a huge selling point, not necessarily to the audience, but to investors and funding partners. The implied sales pitch was, Beyond might not have worked out as we hoped, but the next one has Thor, and you do not want to miss out on that. At least that was the idea. However, the initial contracts with the Kelvin timeline cast were only for 3 movies. So for a 4th film, new contracts would have to be signed with everyone, and everyone would want a pay raise. Time was of the essence, as Paramount and Bad Robot wanted a Star Trek IV announcement out and making waves before the release of Star Trek Beyond. The supporting cast were assumed to fall in line later, so the priority was to secure the participation of Chris Pine, Chris Hemsworth, and Zachary Quinto, and secure it fast. It is not outside the realm of possibility that with a deadline ticking, Paramount and Bad Robot promised the actors a higher amount than they would have received under normal circumstances. In the end though, all 3 signed on and Star Trek IV was announced on July 21st of 2016, the day before the release of Star Trek Beyond. The press release stated that, in the next installment of the epic space adventure, Chris Pine's Captain Kirk will cross paths with a man he never had a chance to meet, but whose legacy has haunted him since the day he was born, his father. The day after, Star Trek Beyond opened to middling numbers. It would soon become clear that the movie was underperforming worse than anyone thought possible. No matter how investor-friendly the Star Trek IV pitch might have been, Star Trek IV ended up in limbo for the next 2 years, unable to secure funding. Securing funding wasn't a problem just for Star Trek, but for Paramount at large. A series of poor greenlighting decisions led to most of their high-profile movies bombing, and to the studio accruing more than $10 billion in debt. Chinese investors losing so much on Paramount movies actually contributed to Beijing altering their financial legislation to make investing in American movies more difficult, which in turn saw Paramount lose their access to Chinese capital. In February of 2018, at the quarterly conference call, Viacom Chief Financial Officer Wade Davis addressed the new strategy which aimed at turning Paramount Pictures around under a new management. This strategy can be summarized as, make more movies with audience appeal on smaller budgets. Since Paramount only has so many franchises with audience appeal, this strategy gave Star Trek on film a new lease on life, at least for the time being. But the massive blockbuster budgets of the earlier Kelvin timeline movies were off the table, and investors still needed to be won over with offers they couldn't refuse. To this end, the offering of Star Trek IV guest starring Chris Hemsworth was recycled, and another selling point was added in the form of female director S.J. Clarkson. The biggest selling point perhaps from an investor's point of view though, was the much reduced risk in the form of a much reduced budget. But in order to change Star Trek IV from the high-end 4-quadrant blockbuster it had originally been conceived as, into the medium-budget production it now had to become, cast salaries had to be cut accordingly. We do not know how much Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth were promised for their participation in Star Trek IV, but we do know that Pine was paid $6 million for Star Trek Beyond. So he and Chris Hemsworth both were likely promised much more than that. If Paramount and Bad Robot were to honor what they agreed to pay 2 years earlier when Star Trek IV was first announced, the film would no longer be a medium-budget movie and therefore not be attractive to investors and hence not get made at all. As such, Paramount tried to bargain with the cast about reducing their salaries in order to bring the total cost down. Instead of the earlier agreed upon fee up front, the actors were offered a bigger chunk of the back end. Chris Hemsworth and Chris Pine would have none of it, as unless the movie turned out to be a smash hit, there would be no back end. The parties could not come to any agreement. On August 10th, The Hollywood Reporter broke the scoop that Chris Pine and Chris Hemsworth had both dropped out. According to The Hollywood Reporter, Paramount insiders said the movie remained a priority development and was not being put on hold. In other words, Star Trek IV was moving on full steam ahead, even without Pine and Hemsworth. That line was meant to calm investors about selling point Chris Hemsworth dropping out, let alone Chris Pine, who they took for granted would be there. Investors were not calmed. Walking the red carpet at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 7th, 1 month after walking away from the negotiations table, Chris Pine for the first time spoke publicly about the situation. Variety asked him what's happening with Star Trek IV, to which he replied, "I don't know. I would love to be involved and we will see what happens. I'll wait for the phone call. Until then, I look forward to it." 1 month later, on October 10th, Carl Urban addressed the situation in a New York Comic-Con roundtable. On the status of Star Trek IV, Urban said, "I know nothing about Star Trek. I wish I did. No news. Apparently, there is no news." Urban is not wrong. We at Midnight's Edge have been told by inside sources with knowledge of the situation that at the time of the original negotiations, Paramount, Bad Robot, and Skydance had managed to scrape together somewhere between $70 and $80 million to make the movie. Unless they managed to come by more, Pine, Hemsworth, and Quinto all had to take pay cuts steep enough that both their salaries and the actual production of the movie would be covered by that amount, and there still had to be enough left over to pay the rest of the cast as well. But when Pine and Hemsworth dropped out, so did the investors that had put the $70 to $80 million on the table. They simply weren't interested in funding a Star Trek movie without Hemsworth, let alone one without Chris Pine as Kirk. So they walked and took their money elsewhere. When Chris Pine 1 month later said he would love to be involved and he would await the phone call, what he actually said was that Paramount knows his asking price and he is waiting for the call saying that he is getting that. That call will not be forthcoming anytime soon, as the money they had allocated for Star Trek IV now is gone. This is also why Urban hasn't heard anything. There is no news, or rather, there is no money. The current status of Star Trek IV is that the movie has lost the funding it once had, and they are hard at work behind the scenes trying to raise more. The challenge facing them is that even when they had Pine and Hemsworth on board, they were only able to scrape together in the vicinity of $80 million, and those were hard to come by. Now, they are trying to convince investors to buy into the sequel of a movie which lost more than $100 million. A sequel which doesn't have the lead star most associated with the franchise. Do you think they will be successful, or is the Star Trek Kelvin franchise dead and adrift in space? Let us know in the comments, and check back soon for our upcoming video on Star Trek Discovery and the fall of Leslie Moonves. If you like this video, then please click the subscribe button. And don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified for all the latest uploaded content. Due to recent changes to YouTube's monetization policies, we'd also like to ask you to please consider supporting Midnight's Edge and its sister channel Midnight's Edge After Dark through Patreon. As thanks for their support, patrons will receive early notifications of mini documentaries, special behind the scenes making of the Edge videos, bloopers, outtakes, lost episodes, and more. You can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. Be sure to check back for news and analysis on the corporate politics behind your favorite genre movies, as well as updates and discussion here at Midnight's Edge. If you like this video, then please click the subscribe button. And don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified for all the latest uploaded content. Due to recent changes to YouTube's monetization policies, we'd also like to ask you to please consider supporting Midnight's Edge and its sister